I think we've heard a bit about the difficulties already of capital flowing into these sort of hard-to-abate sort of sectors. Can you give us some examples of the type of sectors that receive limited financing despite being so critical to the transition?
Sure. Thank you so much, Nicola, and thank you very much, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the question. This topic is very close to my heart, as Sean already covered. This is fundamentally why Just Climate exists, to do these hard things. At Just Climate, we are focused on directing capital towards commercializing and scaling these solutions that have the potential to decarbonize some of the highest emitting sectors of the global economy. And the reality is that there are many sectors which remain off track. And what's interesting is that even though these sectors contribute a very significant share of global emissions, they receive disproportionately small share of climate finance. And we see this disparity not only as a challenge, but also as an opportunity. To give you some examples, we're talking about steel, cement, aviation, shipping, industrial heat, chemicals, heavy-duty transport, power systems, particularly in emerging markets. And I can elaborate on some of these examples, why it is so difficult, and then also happy to talk about how we are working to find business models to make it work. So in case of steel, for example, the preferred decarbonization pathway is direct iron reduction combined with electric arc furnace. This technology is effectively de-risked, it's available, but it remains significantly more expensive compared to conventional blast furnace production, particularly if you compare this to the cost of producing from fully depreciated existing asset base. And at the same time, the costs are driven by the cost of green hydrogen, the need for significant renewable electricity, and also very significant upfront capital requirements. And then at the same time, steel is a globally traded commodity, which means that it's difficult for producers to pass on high costs, to secure long-term offtake agreements required to unlock financing. Another example is cement, which arguably is even more difficult to decarbonize because unlike many industries where majority of emissions is associated with energy use, 2/3 of cement emissions come from the chemistry of production process itself. There are near-term solutions that help reduce these emissions through reduction of clinker content, but traditional SCMs, those supplementary solutions, they experience increasing constraints in supply. Maybe final example that I'll bring is shipping, where again, the industry hasn't yet converged on what is the preferred decarbonization pathway. Green methanol, green ammonia, e-fuels, biofuels, hydrogen, they all have potential, but they each face significant challenges around costs, infrastructure, and that combined with effectively a long vessel life and the fact that these fuels remain 2 to 5 times more expensive than conventional bunker fuel means that this uncertainty around what is the preferred pathway that has delayed investment decisions across the entire value chain. And so each sector is different and needs careful review, but what combines these sectors that they're all capital intensive, they require significant upfront capital, they often provide commoditized products. And historically, investors thought that it might be too complex or too early from technical or commercial perspective to invest in these areas. And while we also recognize these challenges, we also believe that these sectors represent some of the most important investment opportunities of the next decade because they remain undercapitalized. And so we believe that while these sectors remain off track today, there is a potential to significantly accelerate this transition by helping build businesses, partnerships, financial structures that help support low carbon solutions to become competitive and hopefully ultimately win in the market.
Great. Thank you, Natalia. I think that gave us a real insight into the sort of practical challenges of these sort of really important sectors, I guess, from a sort of economic development perspective. I mean, maybe, I guess, more on the sort of positive side. If you look across your portfolio, where have you really seen the business case really materializing for some of these sorts of decarbonization technologies? Because obviously in the first panel, we also talked about really making the commercial case for these technologies. So have you seen some really successful examples of that?
Sure, that's a great question. And I would like to start by answering it with how we make investments. We think that investing in these sectors requires deep sector expertise, thoughtful structuring, and really willingness to engage with complexity. Sean spoke beautifully about how we've built this specialist team with the expertise spanning across engineering, construction, industrial value chains, project finance, and that's absolutely critical in this. And finally, before we make any investments, we undertake what we call a roadmap process, where we effectively map out all the key players within the value chain, trying to understand the key challenges. We assess regulatory, commercial, financial frameworks. And in fact, what we're trying to do, we are not trying to identify simply a promising technology. What we are trying to understand what would make that technology scale. And to come back to examples that I gave just now, so steel, cement, shipping, these are all the sectors that despite the challenges, we think we were able to identify and structure what we believe attractive investment opportunities. In case of steel, Sean mentioned we are investors in Stegra, and what made that investment compelling is not just technology itself, but the whole ecosystem around it. And the project is located in northern Sweden, where availability of low-cost renewable electricity supports competitive production of green hydrogen. Importantly, the company was also able to secure long-term offtake agreements with leading automotive manufacturers willing to pay premium for low-carbon steel. And these commercial agreements unlocked project financing required to fund this green steel facility. In case of cement, we invested in a company called TerraCO2. They produce engineered supplementary cementous materials, which are compatible with the existing regulation and industry standards. It is competitive without the subsidies. And they're also produced from abandoned feedstocks. And then what's interesting, they actually play into the market where the supply of traditional SCMs is now experiencing structural decline, while the demand for cement is expected to continue to grow. So that creates a very compelling business case. And then final example, in case of shipping, we invested in a company called Meva Energy. They're a leader in providing high-performance battery electric systems. And what attracted us there is that today there are vessel categories where full electrification is already economically viable. And then in the near term, we also see a very significant potential for the batteries because green fuels will remain a lot more expensive. And so it makes economic sense to pair those, the usage of the green fuels with batteries to improve overall efficiency of the vessel. And what's interesting, what made full electrification for certain vessel categories economic today is the fact that, the EV industry, which is much, much larger, so the scale, the innovation, the manufacturing capacity developed by EV industry, it enabled a very material cost down trajectory on the battery cell side. So that was a key enabler in that case. And so to bring this all together, what we are trying to do, we are trying to identify businesses which address real bottlenecks today, where we can see a credible path to commercialization, and where the value is created precisely by addressing some of the most difficult decarbonization problems that the global economy is facing. So that's how we think that there is a really impactful way of aligning climate impact with financial returns.
I think it's really encouraging to hear those examples. I think in these really difficult sectors, and we're really glad to have one of your portfolio examples also with us in the panel, and with Niclas from Meva Energy. So maybe I come to you sort of next to talk us a bit through your sort of solution. So you're developing sort of biomass-based solutions to replace fossil fuel gas-based sort of industrial sort of processes. So can you talk us a bit through what you're doing, how it's really addressing the need to decarbonize high-emissive sectors?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Nicola. So first of all, let me just say which segment out of all these segments that Natalia mentioned that where we are in. So we do decarbonization of industrial heat. And let me just say a few words more about that particular segment for you in order to understand how massively big it is. So out of the 53 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions that we are polluting on an annual basis globally today, 35% is associated with industrial heat emissions. And out of those 35%, about 50% is about high temperature processes. And that is precisely where we fit. So what we have done in practice is that we are a technology development company. We are right now going through the very interesting phase of industrialization. And we have developed a methodology to produce a new type of biogas based on biomass gasification and biochar within the same process. So we produce a renewable biogas type and in parallel this biochar byproduct. So we also have the carbon sink potential of the biochar there. And we're offering this to must-abate sectors, as we now call them, widely. We have started out with tissue paper drying, so our first-of-a-kind plant is up and running with a soft tissue paper producer in Sweden, delivering about 80 megawatt hours of gas on a daily basis. And then we have other contracts with IKEA Industry that is about utilizing the residue from furniture production for the same purpose, producing biogas, replacing fossil energy. And there are also other projects within our sales pipeline and beyond, which are within quite different types of sectors here. So we are broadly addressing not only pulp and paper and furniture, but also metallurgy, copper production, aluminum production, ceramics, glass production. Basically, all of those industries where we have a lot of heat consumption in the manufacturing industries. That's what we do. But then the second question is, of course, how do we do it? How do you build a company like this? What processes do you need to have to go through? And basically, it is about trying to do things very rapidly, developing the technology very rapidly, taking risks in that process, and at the same time making sure that you have market traction, that you have good sales opportunities all the time, and keeping up with funding. Obviously, those three things need to be in the air at the same time, while also building a company. So it's a lot about making sure that all the normal functions of a company, HSE, HR, finance, etc., needs to be there as well when you're transforming. Can't just be an engineering team. You need to have everything in place, right? So that's what we do. That's what we are, and obviously we are very purpose-driven, and we like to have more light on the manufacturing segment. We think that is a segment that deserves more attention. Transportation has been an area where there have been massive efforts already, but there are still a lot of things to do within manufacturing.
Right. And I would be also quite interested to hear your current perspective on the sort of market opportunity in light of the increased challenges from a macroeconomic and geopolitical context around energy security, which was also something that was sort of touched on in our first panel. Because clearly, countries and companies face really energy security challenges, and at the same time need to match that to their decarbonization targets. So how do you see those two issues coming together?
Yeah, is it a true shift, or is it a rebranding, renaming? Obviously you need to position yourself a little bit different now. That's totally clear. But the great thing is, of course, that decarbonization and security of supply, at least for Europe, and when it comes to hydrocarbons, that is the same thing. After all, about 75% of the hydrocarbons that are being used in the EU, at least, are imported, and getting rid of that dependency is now a subject matter that is on the policy agenda all over Europe, I think. First, we had the dependency on Russia. Obviously, as from this year onwards, we're not importing any Russian natural gas or oil products into the EU anymore. No more new contracts are to be signed. Then we had obviously the dependency on the Hormuz Strait. The last few months of turmoil there has also put a light on that sensitivity. And now, as it turns out, I guess the Republican Guard there, they have the key to the strait, and what will that mean in terms of dependency? That's food for thought for Europe. And what's then happening is that the US is turning out to be the main hydrocarbon supplier for Europe in the next few years. So while the US had about 20% of the market share for European hydrocarbons up until a couple of years ago, I think they are set to have 75% next year, and maybe that's not something that we are too happy about either. So this is much more than decarbonization now. This is about independence, security of supply, and we think it's just great that those two things for once work in the same direction. Sometimes you talk about the energy trilemma, and then you have security of supply, sustainability, and the third one is then affordability, and that is obviously the next thing for this to really rock. We need to come down in price. We need to show that the price curves are there, that we can make things more efficient, getting more energy out of the primary fuel that we're utilizing, make it usable for the customer. I think that would be the story for at least the bioenergy sector for the next few years. But we should harvest whatever we have in Europe. We have plenty of wind, we have solar, we have a lot of biomass. Biomass is, after all, nothing else than just stored solar energy, so we should make good use of it. And there are great opportunities to step away from this dependency, that's for sure.
Right. I mean, obviously, what you mentioned around the energy trilemma is also something that's quite pertinent in an emerging market context, where there are also issues of energy security, energy access, the need for industrialization, the need for affordable prices as well. And that's why I think, obviously, transition finance is so close also to BII's heart to really drive more capital into this space. So maybe flipping to the emerging market context with Phil as well from Helios. Because you made a recent investment in Beta Glass, which is a leading industrial platform in West Africa. Can you describe a bit what made the investment compelling and how you're approaching decarbonization in this really energy-intensive sector?
Yeah. Okay, so Beta Glass, for context, is a glass manufacturing business. It's the largest in Nigeria. It's one of the largest in West Africa. And it produces glass bottles, jars for the food, pharmaceutical and beverage sectors. So imagine the classic Coca-Cola bottle that we're all familiar with. They produce a lot of those, so in excess of 850 million bottles per year. So a huge manufacturing base, obviously in a market that is growing significantly. when we looked at this this business, and just say that obviously it is quite energy intensive, and I'll talk about the sort of challenges around sort of abating sort of the emissions and energy with this sector. But when we looked at the business, it had already made a sort of net zero target, similar to many businesses sort of 5-6 years ago when everyone was coming out with 2050 net zero targets. But when we did the diligence and we look at, okay, so what's the plan to get there, there wasn't really any substance to it at all, which again is not unusual. And we then, as part of sort of the value creation plan initiative, did really think about what are the sort of practical steps that we could take with this business to sort of decarbonize it. You know, we had a very willing management team, which is great, and we worked very closely with them to really think about what initiatives we could really introduce. So the three main ones we came up with was, the first one was around the increased use of recycled glass or cullet. Now, virgin glass is made up essentially of sand, soda ash and limestone. Obviously, it's quite energy intensive as a virgin material. The cullet has a lower melting point. So essentially, the more cullet we can use in the manufacturing process, the more efficient the furnace is, the lower emissions, cost savings for the business as well. The challenge, though, in a place like Nigeria is, where do you source the recycled glass from? There isn't, you know, the advanced sort of, you know, waste management practices and infrastructure you see in other parts of the world. So one of the things we're trying to work with the company on is kind of how do we help, you know, create that infrastructure, and how do we collect more of that sort of waste cullet? And that doesn't just have an environmental positive, it also has a social one as well, in terms of we're thinking about it from a jobs impact and a local economic contribution perspective as well. The second area was around increased use of solar and energy efficiency. One of the plants already has quite a lot of solar, and you know, we're looking at whether one of the second plants can also adopt that. That isn't going to solve the sort of decarbonisation challenge for the business, but it is a step in the right direction. And given the lower cost of solar energy, you know, that should stand on its own 2 feet from a commercial grounds perspective, including with sort of energy efficiency initiatives. And then the third one is around the furnaces themselves. And this is kind of where the biggest opportunity is, and I think where transition finance can really, really help. So on the furnace side, you know, you talked about, you know, biogas, for example. You know, these are the sort of technologies which I think can ultimately help. However, in places like West Africa, you know, one of these sites is in the Niger Delta. You know, where do you source, you know, those sorts of, you know, biogases at a sort of price that is competitive? That's, for me, the biggest challenge. One of the things that we've been looking at is kind of transitional financing, in terms of how can we apply, you know, best available technologies to make the existing furnaces as efficient as possible, as well as, you know, for thinking about, you know, new and future furnaces that we develop. But essentially, you know, the furnace question is the biggest one with this business. Until you crack that, you're never going to decarbonize the business to sort of a net zero place. But in terms of the other initiatives and the initiatives that we're sort of working towards, you know, we've incorporated those into the value creation plans. We've aligned management incentives around delivering those things as well, which I think is really, really important.
Great, thank you. I think these were some real practical insights on really the decarbonisation levers in such an energy-intensive sort of business. You mentioned some of the constraints already in terms of the supply chain, some of the location-specific constraints as well. Were there any other sort of constraints that you had to deal with, any sort of other learnings, and also how you, I guess, then turned it into an opportunity in this investment?
Yeah, I think this investment's been a really positive one from a decarbonisation. As I mentioned earlier, eager, willing management team. When we talk to some other companies, sometimes that's more of a challenge, even with the investment teams as well. You know, we are a returns-driven firm, and, you know, looking at the private equity 5 to 7 year time horizon, it's kind of like, what can we do within that term? What's going to drive returns? Is it going to have an exit, you know, premium to it? potential investors in that business going to care about this or not? And these are all the questions that I have to sort of answer. For this business, absolutely, it makes sense. It's energy cost is single biggest cost by a long way. I think where it's less of a percentage, it's maybe harder to get people's focus and attention on it. And I think that's kind of where some of the challenges come in. But I think where you have that engaged management team, where you align incentives, that creates a huge opportunity.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to then draw out a sort of demonstration effect that it could have, right?
Yeah.
In terms of a certain sector, really bringing forward these sort of successful examples for the broader market, and to potentially replicate and see the the commercial benefits as you outlined them. So I think it's really positive, I guess. From
in Nigeria, there's probably not a huge long list of net zero aligned businesses. So how can you make some examples of those companies? Really I think it's a really positive thing to do.
Right. It's great that we're sort of concluding that part of the panel with a sort of positive note, despite some of the challenges. So I'll open it up for questions now from the audience.
Thank you. My name is Frederick. I have a question for Niclas. What do you think are the main drivers for your clients in sort of paying for your services? I mean, I'd like to think they take their net zero targets very seriously. Yeah. How big a part do their net zero targets play in sort of purchasing your services, let's put it that way?
They are certainly there. That's super important for them because they have their own 2030 targets or 2035 targets in terms of decarbonization, and they have matured enough to take action on those targets as well. So it's not just about communication; it's about proving real decarbonization figures. At the same time, when you sit there together with the purchase department, when you're faced with a big corporate that are well versed in negotiation and pricing, etc., that's a somewhat a little bit of a different story sometimes. So both things needs to be there, and that's fine, because everybody understands at the end of the day that in order for this to really make it, it needs to be competitive. Where we are today, and where every technology developer is at some part of their process, is that it takes a bit of time to really push price down. We should remember that when we talk about hydrocarbons in particular, we have so many standards. We have more than 100 years of efficiency in the processes, and challenging all of that at the same time is quite difficult. So it's important to be on a trajectory to be able to show low cost production, and then of course you also have to make active use of the facilitators that are out there. There is a grant landscape. Some countries and regions, they have tariffs that are supporting this type of operation. Make sure to make use of that, because those are there for that purpose. I think I can add one thing more, which is a clear learning, and that is that the companies that maybe are easiest to work with in this context are the ones that have a vision, right? And it's striking that many of the companies that have that solid visions, they are being run by families. They are not, generally speaking, publicly listed companies where the power is in the hands of the officers, but rather there is somebody that is a long-term owner and that wants to create his or her own legacy as well. That makes those types of discussions easier. That's for sure.
Yeah, I can complement that by saying this is very much in line with what we are seeing across many industries, where the adoption, the large-scale adoption, it has to be driven by the commercial case, by unit economics. So the conversation might start in a sustainability department looking to achieve some of these goals, but actual procurement decision always is linked to, okay, what are the unit economics? What are we saving? When it comes to industrial heat, you're talking to very conservative client base. If you're thinking about the production manager who had a wonderful production process, frying his potatoes in a way he's been doing that for decades, And then suddenly someone says, well, why don't you explore this great alternative? And then the question is like, okay, why should I take the risk? Why should I take the risk of revenue disruption if this technology doesn't work? So it's very important to, I think, similar to what we heard in the first panel, to frame it in a way that it makes economic and commercial sense, and then the discussion becomes a lot more productive. So in case of Segra, the reason why they were able to secure these long-term offtake agreements for what is a commoditized product traded in a global market is because for them, the cost of steel in the ultimate product, in the final cost of the vehicle, represents a very small share. But at the same time, it's a very significant lever for them to achieve their decarbonization targets. So that creates this opportunity to bear a form of premium and create an attractive economic case.
I think you mentioned that energy is the highest cost. Solar is the cheapest form of energy. I presume there are technological barriers, but why aren't they using solar as a cost-effective way to change? Is it because electricity can't produce the temperature you need for your glass factories?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, unfortunately, it wouldn't be an option with solar. The amount of solar panels you'll need would be.
And how many industries are limited by that? Is it common throughout many industries where solar can't produce or electricity really can't produce the amount of heat needed?
That's a difficult question to answer in general terms, I think. I once recall IKEA stating that they had made that calculation and they came up with a maximum power production of 20%, well, representing their consumption. 20% of their consumption was to be represented by solar, but that was related to the European manufacturing operations. Might be different elsewhere, of course. And again, that was maybe not also taking it into account batteries and storage. So things are also changing. We might come up with one answer here today, and a couple of years from now, the correct answer would be something else.
I think another reason why it doesn't apply to all industries, because a lot of these industrial processes, they run 24/7.
Yeah.
So the intermittency of renewable electricity production prevents them from being the sole source of energy. So it needs to be paired with something. What we are seeing now is that there are solutions of combining renewable solar and wind with thermal batteries, for example, where as a combined technology, they can be a good alternative as well.
Great. I think we had another question.
Thanks so much for the discussion so far. I'm Aditi Gupta from FinDev Canada. I'm curious, when you invest, when do you think decarbonization is sufficient enough to invest? We heard from you that there are some low-hanging fruits with decarbonization, there's harder to do stuff. Would you turn away an investment opportunity if there is not sufficient decarbonization? What does sufficient decarbonization look like?
Well, I'm happy to kick off this discussion. So, as Sean alluded in his remarks, our mission is to effectively innovate in climate finance, to identify and structure investments where we can achieve both, where we can achieve attractive commercial returns, but also deliver attractive G&G abatement targets. And for us, these two priorities, they go in tandem. So there isn't trading one for another. And the reason why it is so important is because we do need these successes. So we do need to demonstrate commercial success. We can't do something on a consensual basis because of significant impact, because this model does not scale. So what's critical is to create the scale, to create the positive momentum, which brings the success breeds success. So it kind of aligns more capital and more solutions become economically viable. In terms of practical decisions that we make, of course, every opportunity is different, and we apply a portfolio approach. So we might invest in one opportunity where the G&G abatement, let's say, is disproportionate, and that allows us to maybe be more flexible in other areas. So it is kind of like applying this portfolio approach to how we make investments.
Phil, do you maybe want to?
Yeah, I'll maybe add. So I guess we look at it in two distinct ways. So one, we have a dedicated climate fund called CLEAR, which invests in climate solutions. There we would be looking for some meaningful climate sort of positive impact. It can't be around the edges, it needs to be quite substantial, and that's something that we look at very closely at due diligence, and the IC will look at. Beta Glass was actually invested through our private equity strategy, where where we don't have sort of those guardrails to the same extent as we do with the sort of climate fund, and therefore the sort of climate decarbonisation initiatives that we're looking at have to really stand up on their own grounds from a commercial perspective, to be honest, within a sort of reasonable time frame, and we'll push that as far as we can in terms of hopefully what the benefits will be from a decarbonisation perspective.
Thank you very much for the discussion to the panel. I mean, just reflecting a little bit on everything you said, it feels like the stars need to align for transition finance to scale. But I was wondering if you see an opportunity in the next 5 years where there is a technology that could be more uniformly adopted, and where local dynamics, market dynamics, regulation, company desire can potentially align.
Who wants to have a go at this?
I'm happy to start. I think the unfortunate reality is that there isn't one size fits all approach here. So I think I opened with the comment that I think investing in these sectors requires the willingness to engage with complexity, to understand what are the levers, how can we create this commercial framework, and think of it in a holistic way so that business economics work. I think what has been discussed in the previous panel is that sometimes you don't try to tackle all these problems at once. So adopting what has worked in previous contexts and try to sort of like layer on top is important. I think where we see some more uniform approach, I think areas around battery storage. So again, here we already have seen how quickly then utility scale battery energy storage has been adopted in many countries, but there is still a very significant potential. Things around energy often are linked to permitting issues, interconnection issues, and all of these areas require very significant and deep understanding of regulatory frameworks and so on. But I would also make a comment in line with what Niclas was saying in terms of the energy security and what we are currently facing. I think there is an opportunity, like crisis is an opportunity as well. So right now, with the focus on energy security and a degree of willingness to pay premium for this, that's in a way an opportunity to get on that cost down trajectory, to leverage the willingness to pay premium to scale some of the technologies which so far perhaps have been deprioritized.
Yeah, I think so. Our first investment in our climate fund was in battery swapping for 2- and 3-wheelers, and having gone to it's a business that actually is based in India but moving into Africa, and speaking to some of their customers and hearing from them about how actually these are the sorts of things that we're looking for: better, cleaner, cheaper. And that's exactly an example of that. It's better, maintenance is less, it's cleaner, and it's about 30 to 40% cheaper for the consumer as well. And I think in places like Africa or India, where the consumer is extremely cost conscious, I think that gives great hope for sort of increased rollout and adoption, where sort of capital can be deployed to allow the sort of infrastructure to be in place so that the consumers can then sort of lean into it. And there was an article in the FT this morning about saying that the sort of the Middle East war has actually driven increased adoption in Africa to sort of e-mobility, which at least that's one positive thing that came out of it.
Sure. I think we have to conclude the panel here, but I think it's been a very positive panel in terms of really talking through the sort of solutions as well, despite some of the real life challenges. But I think it's fair to say, I think in the last few years we really have seen that some of these technological solutions are really starting to break through, and I think we need more of those examples to really make the practical and particularly the commercial case, I think, which was a sort of common theme across our panel to scale transition finance further. I think we're taking a break now, if that's right. Yes. So please refresh yourselves. Obviously, it's very hot, so hopefully some drinks will be outside. And then I think we're coming back at 3:30 as well, where we go deeper into some of these discussions and also look into our report, which hopefully can make a sort of useful contribution how to sort of scale transition finance further. So yeah, see you at 3:30.